Hi, it's Shelly, dietitian and nutrition mindset coach. Today I'm going to be talking a little bit about one technique that I based on this idea, this phrase that I've heard over and over and over every time I step onto the airplane, is one technique to manage a stressful situation as you're heading into it, rather than waiting for it to happen and then reacting to it. So the reason I'm talking about this is not just because stress management is really helpful for our emotional health, but it's also really helpful for our physical health. Like stress, it causes a lot of negative things to happen in our body. It contributes to inflammation. Some people respond to stress by eating really fast, or eating certain foods that they may not be hungry for, or eating it in a certain way that maybe takes all the enjoyment out of the food. So, for example, maybe you're stuck in traffic and you have this soda that you're drinking, and there's nothing wrong with drinking soda, but instead of actually enjoying your soda, you swallowed it all down because you're so frustrated at this traffic that is around you, and why is this car moving so slowly, that before you know it, it's all gone. Or you have just talked to somebody, and every time you see them, you just have to crunch through an entire bag of potato chips or peanut M&Ms or something like that, because they are so stressful. It is so stressful to talk to them, and it's just like, oh, I just need something to get my energy up. And maybe you're not even doing this intentionally, maybe it happens accidentally, or you just don't enjoy how you feel when you're that stressed out, or you try to avoid the situations. But some of the situations, they're just not avoidable. Like sometimes we just have to be in situations that are a little bit stressful or that we don't like. So how are we going to handle these situations before we even get into them? And that's what I wanted to talk about. So in case you haven't figured out from the title, the phrase is something that you hear every time you step on a plane, and they say, know your closest exit. Where's your emergency exit? Be aware that the closest might be behind you. So that there's two parts to that, right? One is know where it is ahead of time, and two is know that it might be behind you. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that. Having something prepared in advance makes it a little bit easier to tolerate a situation, right? So if it's a stressful situation, knowing that you have kind of an escape route, or you have something that's already set, lets you relax a little bit. It tells you that you've already controlled the things that you can control, because you're not in charge of the entire situation. You can only control your thoughts and your behaviors. So if you've already planned for what you are going to say or do, then it kind of takes a little bit of that burden off. You don't have to decide that in the moment. You can go into it and be like, oh yeah, it's okay. I already know what's going to happen here. So one example might be have something specific prepared to say. So if you have somebody that always makes a comment, or always like a certain conversation always comes up, or a certain thing just kind of, if there's a pattern, you can kind of expect it, then you can have a couple of phrases planned out in advance. So you can think about it and be like, okay, well, I wish I could say these things. Instead of having to come up with them in the moment, you can go into the situation knowing what you're going to say. If there's a certain person that is always like, oh, they always complain and this just drives you crazy, you can also have something prepared, like a redirect statement, or something else that you would like to talk about, just a conversation changer or something like that. If you want to know something to do, you could always do like plan to go to the bathroom. I mean, you don't have to go to the bathroom. You can just step inside and like get away from the situation for a little bit. This works for meetings. Sometimes this works for like parties or other things like that. Events, anything that there's a bathroom nearby, and it's not unusual for you to ask to go to the bathroom, or just to excuse yourself to go to the bathroom, right? If like obviously it might not work for traffic, unless you just really couldn't stand it anymore and you just wanted to take a little break and go off somewhere else, and then just like not be in the traffic in that moment. That's okay too. You could also step outside for a phone call, or just to get some air. Maybe it's too hot in the room or something and you want to get some fresh air, or it's too cold in the room and you want to get some sun, depending on what time of year you are in and where you live. Maybe you have to go to the car and grab something, those kinds of things. Like you can kind of have a couple of them to work with in your brain and be like, okay, this is the one that I'm going to be comfortable enough to say in this situation. So you can have that in the back of your head, and you don't have to use it. You can just have it there like as a security blanket if you wanted to. if you wanted to take a bigger step, like you're not sure if you're really going to be able to do that, or if that's just not going to be enough time away, you can plan for something bigger. You can plan to go like get a mani-pedi or get a facial, or get a massage, or even be the person who runs the errands, right? Like if it's a big party or something, you can be like, oh, do you have something last minute? I'll totally volunteer to go grab that thing for you, just so that you can get away. If you want to schedule it in advance, like, oh, while I was here in town, I thought I would, do a little shopping trip for my friends back home. So I need to step away for like, an hour or so to get that done, and then I'll be back with you guys after that. And you can always do that. You can plan that in advance, and then you can cancel it if you don't need it, right? If you are having a great time and you don't really need that experience of stepping away in that space, then maybe you can just be like, okay, I'm just going to enjoy it right here and not have to worry about having that escape route. The second piece of that, the phrase is, it might be behind you. So one technique is to learn from your past experiences, whether they're good or bad, whether the outcome was what you intended or not. There's always something that you can learn. So are there previous situations that were stressful that you handled really well, or that something, like whether you did it intentionally or not, something just got resolved? Is there something that you can figure out from there, either a specific instance, like something actually happened, you said something or you did something that made you like help you step back in that moment, or somebody else gave you some excuse, like intentionally or unintentionally, something just happened and you had that space, or is there some like a bigger category of things that might happen, like a pattern that you could see? So there might not be a specific thing that you can place, like, oh, this is exactly the moment, but maybe you just had a sense of space, or maybe you had this idea that, oh yeah, I knew what I was going to say if this conversation came up, or I knew, I just felt like it was going to be okay. Like I had this thing that I went in thinking, like a way of framing a situation or something like that, like some bigger piece that you can carry into another situation that might not be exactly the same. If the situation didn't go as ideal, like you responded really poorly, or you weren't the person you wanted to be in that situation, or it was just more stressful than you thought it was going to be, what might be one thing, without beating yourself up about it, what might be one thing that you could change, one small thing that you could change to give you a different outcome? And in this situation, you're not really looking for like, how would I totally revamp this entire scenario? This is saying, okay, what one moment might be really helpful for me to tweak in the next time? Because it's really a trial and error, right? So you don't know for sure how any of this is going to go, because you don't control the entire outcome. You don't control the entire situation. So these are things that you can prepare for, you can try out, and as you try them out, you're going to change them, and you're going to figure out what works better for your personality and what works better for certain situations than others. And so even when you're looking back and you're saying, oh, well, these things really worked or didn't work in this situation, it's not as helpful to be like, well, here's the entire way that I would change everything. It might be more helpful and much more manageable to be like, here's one specific thing that I would change, rather than saying, oh, well, I just would not go into that situation at all. And maybe that's the answer for some things, but specifically about the things that you can't avoid, it's really nice to have like something else that you can try, and to approach it as, I'm experimenting in this moment, right? This is kind of like an adventure. It's like a little science experiment where you're like, okay, I'm going to see how it is. And even that can help you kind of frame things in a little bit of like, I'm not a victim where everything is stressful and it's happening to me. It's more of like, okay, I'm an observer, I'm a scientist, and I'm going to try this one thing and test a hypothesis, right? I'm going to see if this is really working. So in those two things, know your closest exit, so prepare in advance, and then find out, looking behind you, right? The closest one might be in the past. So finding out from your past what might be the most helpful, and then bringing those into the future, right? Bringing some of those ideas into the future. So in terms of, if this is something that isn't, like maybe it does get stressful even with all these preparations, and what are you going to do about it? You can prepare for that as well. Like it's not to say you can't stress eat or you can't do this thing, because when we put those restrictions on ourselves, sometimes our brains start to be like, well, this is the off limits thing, and now I have to do it. And And then you're just in this huge battle, right? And it becomes a battle of willpower, and that's just not something that you can deal with all the time when you're already stressed. So sometimes it's a little easier to say, okay, well, my plan is actually going to be that I check in with myself. I take a deep breath, and before I decide to eat this food, or before I decide, sometimes, like for me, there's negative thoughts that come up specifically when I'm stressed. They don't usually come up in other times, like these specific thoughts, they don't usually come up in other times. They come up only triggered by stress. And so sometimes it's helpful to come into a situation knowing, like, if when I do get stressed, even if all these things didn't work out, I can just take a deep breath and I can ask myself, would I feel differently if I was less stressed? And a lot of times the answer is yes. Sometimes I just say, okay, if the answer is yes, or if I'm not sure, I can put this aside for now, right? So like I am not fighting that I do feel like this. I'm not fighting this negative thought to try to like change it into a positive, or tell myself that I can't eat something or can't feel frustrated or stressed. I'm just saying, okay, I feel this way right now, and I might feel differently later on. So I'm going to package this up right now, and this is not the time to deal with it. And I'm going to put that aside, and I'm going to revisit it later when I'm feeling a little bit different. And that doesn't mean that you can never come back to it. It's not like, oh, I'm advocating don't deal with your feelings. What I'm saying is sometimes there are certain times when you just have too much going on, and really unpacking all of that is not going to be helpful. I find that a lot of times when I do feel better, it's not even an issue anymore. I'm not thinking about it, or it does come up and I'm like, oh, that was silly. I don't need to put attention to that anymore. So just having that pause, that moment where I'm like, okay, I'm acknowledging it, I'm not fighting it, and I'm just going to say, and now this is for later, right? So just separating that a little bit from the harshness of the emotion, the really presentness feeling of the emotion, because it can feel so strong. That gives me a little bit of space. Again, we're talking a lot about the space, right? In the stressful situation, planning for that space, looking for the moments where you had space in the past, figuring out even how you can have space internally to deal with those stressful moments. So it's all about finding and creating that space and planning for that in advance, so that you feel a little bit more empowered going into the situation. So it's not as scary and it's not as stressful to face that situation that you can't get out of all the time, right? Because we'd love to just avoid them, but that's not always realistic. So in those situations where it's not realistic to just avoid it, what are some of those situations? What are the things that we can prepare ourselves with, the tools that we can kind of like bring into those situations to make them a little bit more tolerable? So if you do have any questions, put it in the comments. Let me know if you have an example of how you create space in your life, or how you know your closest exit, or used a past experience to inform the present, and you feel like sharing that publicly. Let me know in the comments, or send me a private message if you don't feel like sharing that. And then if you do want specific things to say, specific ideas to say to people who comment on your food, your body, or your weight, I do have a resource for you called Silencing the Food Police. And you can find that when you sign up for my newsletter. I will link that in the comments and in the description. And then until next week, I'm Shelly, helping you to live fully and freely. Have a good week.